Good times. Oh, I should have started the preview. Now there's going to be an annoying me tapping on the microphone at the beginning of this video, so watch out for that. If you're not here and you're watching this right now for the first time, sorry. So today we're going to be taking a look at deployment. We're going to do another, I know we did this in 301, right? But our apps are a little bit more complex now, right? The apps we built in 301 were pretty simple. The only sort of, what was I going to say? The only sort of environment variable that we had to manage was the connection to our SQL database, right? But now we've already had a handful of different sort of environment variables for us to work with. Things like your S3 credentials, right? Or our app secret for generating JOTs, as well as our database and our port. Although the port we don't have to do anything with. I was also going to do sort of some unit testing of the auth stuff, since we didn't get a chance to do that. When was the last time I taught? That must have been last Thursday, I think. Oh no, we did that on Tuesday. We did some testing for that. So we'll be taking a look at some more testing stuff, some more of the unit testing side of things, and then dive into deployment and continuous integration. We're going to hook this up to a continuous integration service called Travis CI after we get it all tested up. But before we get into any of that stuff, are there any questions right now? Your questions, ask them at me.
Can you just quickly go over like the steps from the S3? Like, I know we go from like one place, we the client sends a file, like we use Multer at some point.
Yeah.
Just like a high level, like.
John would probably be better at doing that.
I guess rewatch the lecture too.
Yeah.
I'll just rewatch the lecture.
Okay. Yeah, I did not study up on the S3 stuff.
That's all good.
Yeah. So no, I can. So no, I cannot. No, I cannot just give an outline of those steps.
Appreciate the honesty.
Other questions? Ask them at me. I may or may not be able to answer them, but ask them anyway. No, nothing.
There was something lingering with me. Can you go over, so we're just choosing to hash this async right now, or is there a reason why
Which part? The password?
Yeah, the password generate hash.
Let's take a look.
Hash async.
Yeah, so the async part of that comes from Bluebird, right? Let me just throw this up. So if we take a look at models user, right? What we're doing is we're actually running a promisify all on a required bcrypt, and then storing the result of that into bcrypt, and that's what gives us this hash async, right? It's just taking that normal hash function, and instead of us passing a callback into it, it returns a promise, right? So that lets us return a promise after we've done the dot then on the result of that, right? Does that make sense?
Why would it, so if we, well, I guess so that we can use promises, we don't have to do that.
Yep.
It's just easier.
Yeah, and you could just do a new promise on this and actually create the promise yourself. I tend to use Bluebird because it's faster than, like you have to write less lines of code. It already does it for you, so rather than having to convert it and possibly making a mistake in that conversion process of like converting it from a callback to a promise, instead we let Bluebird take care of it for us.
For my eyes, it would be too much. Can you rewrite this without Bluebird? Just make a new promise?
Yeah. Yeah, if we did like user schema dot methods, I'll call that one gen hash. All right, so instead we will return a new promise, right, with reject resolve. Actually, is it reject resolve or resolve reject? Resolve reject. Let's check the docs. Yeah, resolve reject. I'm doing this wrong. Okay, so we have the new promise here that we've created. All right, so instead of having bcrypt.hash async, we're going to want to do a bcrypt.hash. We'll still pass in the password and do 10 rounds of salt. We then have a callback function that has that hash in it. It might be an error in a hash, so let me check the bcrypt docs. All right, remember the docs are your friend. I tend to look things up a lot just to make sure before I even like actually just try to write it. Yeah, it's going to be an error hash. Yep. So we have the error and then the hash. So change this to reflect that. And then we could do something like if error return reject error. Right? Just a single line. So we'll stop execution there. We'll reject on that error piece that we got from the bcrypt.hash. Otherwise, we are going to resolve on the hash. Right? I'm then going to do a .then in here off of that promise with that hash. I'll set this .password equals hash, right? And then return this, so that from the promise, right, we are returning the user, right? And this would be basically the same function. You could also just do both those things in that first, like inside of the callback. Oh, I'm putting this .then in the wrong spot, actually. Yep, it has to be there. Yeah. It's still in the wrong spot. It's got to be there. Get rid of that semicolon. All right, and so now these two are functionally equivalent. Right, and we still have the .then where we're doing that same thing. So instead of having to do the return new promise with the resolve reject, calling the bcrypt hash, passing the callback function in, doing the error checking, and either doing a reject or a resolve based upon that, I usually just let Bluebird handle that for me. It's a little bit more foolproof, right? Like I can't screw it up as easily. So one of the reasons why I tend to use Bluebird when I'm doing something like this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So for Lab 17, we authorized with token, right?
Uh-huh.
And one of the tests is asking us to do test for 4 if the request is valid, but there is no ID for that request. And we wrote the module so that it returns an ID. So if there's a token, there must be an ID, right?
Pretty much.
So how can I write a test for that?
Make your own jot, right? So if you wanna test for it, just make a JWT inside of your test that has a bad ID in it, or has something else in it, right?
Oh, so just create a separate okay.
Totally. Yeah, just using the JWT library. Create one that either doesn't have the ID field or contains a bad ID or something like that. But yeah, theoretically, someone having a token that they got from our website, right? That should always work once they have it, basically, as the system's currently designed. Other questions right now? Yeah, and actually, so we used to teach kind of a more complicated version of this. If any of you got tripped up on the find hash method or the find hash piece in the lab description, that's now no longer there. We got rid of it. But the way we used to teach this is you would actually generate a hash. So you would take the user's ID that's stored in the database, right? And then you would hash it using bcrypt and use that hash to find the user. Rather than using the ID to find the user. And kind of the advantage of this piece is if you delete that hash, then the user has to re-sign in, right? So you can basically get rid of all the, if you have like a break-in, right? Someone gets into your server and you want to make sure that everyone has to re-sign in using their username and password, rather than having all these jots floating around that might be being used by an attacker. Right? You can just delete all those find hashes out of every single user in your database, and then everyone has to log in again. You can also use it as a way to sign out, right? Just delete that find hash, and then they have to sign in again before they will have a valid jot, right? So there's some other things in that. We don't teach it that way anymore because it's just kind of an added layer of complexity on top of something that's already fairly complex and has a lot of moving pieces. But that's kind of the way that you would see this in more of a production level system, is using something besides the ID inside of that jot to find the user by. So just something to keep in mind. Other questions right now? Ask them at me. Are we ready to write some tests?
Yeah.
Test time?
Test.
Cool. All right. So when I am starting to unit test something, right, like a function that I've written, I first like to take another look at the code that I wrote. Preferably, I'd be writing the test first, but that rarely happens when you're writing a library or really when you're writing anything. Integration tests you can usually write first, but writing something like a unit test before you actually know what the code needs to do and what it looks like is a little bit difficult. So I'm going to take a look at that basic HTTP and see what this is actually doing, what pieces I'm going to actually need to get this to work, right? So it's a function, right? And it has 3 parameters that go into it. I don't actually want to use actual express, rec, res, next for these things. I want to pass in my own pieces just so I can sort of test this by itself, right, and not test express, right? That's the difference between a unit test and an integration test. Right now we have just integration tests for our auth test, right, where we're actually using the full service. We're creating a user, we're signing into a user. We didn't test sort of when things go wrong. We just kept it pretty simple with just these 2 tests because that's what we had time to write. But what we want to do now is test just this function isolated from the rest of our application, right? So what we're going to need to do is create an object that will allow this to successfully execute, and then create an object that will make this fail, all right? Cowbunga? Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to need to create basically what a basic HTTP authentication would look like, right? And so what does that look like again? Right? What are the pieces of that? First of all, where do we store it? Where do we store the information? Yeah, in the authorization header, right? So in the headers object, we have a field called authorization that's going to contain the pieces that actually comprise the basic HTTP thing, right? Which has at first the string capital B basic, a space, and then a base 64 encoded version of our username : password. Right? So in our test, we're going to have to actually create an object like that and pass it in to rec.headers.authorization as the first parameter of this function. The only other parameter we're using inside of here is next, right? If you look in this, we never call anything off of res. So when we call this function in our test, we'll probably just pass in a null value there. We only need that to have the right arity to get that next parameter, right? So we're going to define our own rec, which will be an object, right? It'll just basically be an object that has a object in it called headers that has the authorization string that we're going to build in it. We don't use any other piece of rec besides when we assign rec.auth to the auth object that we create. All right? Other than that, we're not using anything from rec. So this is kind of how I like to start to break down a unit test, right? When I'm writing one, I like to look at the bare minimum number of pieces that I need in order to get it to test the functionality, right? So really what I need is I need a rec that works for this, a rec that doesn't work for this, right? And a next function defined, right? Cowabunga on that? Questions right now about this approach?
The unit test?
Yeah.
And you need the next defined so we can keep going, or?
No, it doesn't even have to keep going. It's just we call the next function, right, if we successfully authenticate with no parameter, and we call it with an error parameter if it wasn't successful.
Oh, so if it's successful, you're going to call the one, and okay, I got it.
Yep. Cowabunga on that? Cool. All right, well, let's try this out. So let's do a test. I'm just going to call it basic http.test.js in our test directory. Normally, I actually like to split in my test directory, have like an integration test and a unit test, or like back-end, front-end tests, you know, kind of whatever sort of makes sense. I'm just going to keep it simple and just have the one file for the basic HTTP rather than do that. So we'll do use strict. We'll do const basic HTTP equals require name plus slash dot dot slash lib basic dot HTTP. All right. So we'll just create the various rec and next functions when we actually just call it. I think that's going to be easier than defining it in a before block, especially because we're only going to really have two tests in here, one for successful, one for not successful. So I'll just define it for that test. Right? It should parse basic HTTP authentication. We don't have any asynchronous work that we do inside of this, right? Let's double check that. So another consideration to take a look at, are we doing anything asynchronously? Is there any async function that gets called in here, any promise that gets generated, or any callback that we're doing asynchronously in this code?
No.
Yeah, right, no. We don't have anything asynchronously. We're just creating a buffer. We're calling some toString methods, some split methods, and that's kind of about it. There's nothing where we're sending a callback or creating a promise, right?
Yep.
So another thing to take a look at, I don't need to wrap this in a promise because of that. And you'll actually find that this is usually the case when you're doing unit testing, is that most of the time you won't end up having to do anything asynchronously, right? So you'll tend not to have to go through that process. Okay. So we're going to do basic HTTP, all right? As I said, we're just going to call this function. In it, I'm going to create an object. This is going to be the equivalent of my rec object, right? So I'm going to have headers in here. Headers will be an object that has authorization, right? In this, I'm going to use a template string. We'll do a basic space, and then we need to create a buffer where we will have test and guest 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So we're creating this new buffer.
The buffer's holding the test.
What was that?
The buffer's holding the user and task.
Yeah, exactly. And then we're call toString on that, and we need to give it a type of base 64. Right? So we're passing into it test and guessed. I'm going to make this a little bit more readable here, as opposed to doing this all in one line. What's a good way to make this more readable? I can't actually do much about it. Besides do that and that. That's still not super readable.
The new buffer just takes up some of the space.
Yeah, exactly.
Just create a new buffer maybe for the header.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. I'll call it test buff equals new buffer. I don't know why I'm writing this out again. I already have the code right there. Yep. And then here we will do test buff toString base 64. That looks better. Yeah, and I'll do this too. Cool. So we have our headers inside of this object, where we have one field authorization where we're doing basic with test buff toString base 64. Right. So we're taking this test and guessed 1, 2, 3, 4, putting them in a buffer, and then converting that buffer to a base 64 string inside of our authorization string. Oh, do I have to sneeze? Nope, apparently not. All right, so next we're going to pass null as an object into the basic HTTP call. Right, that's going to be our res. Since we never call res inside of the basic HTTP piece of middleware, we don't actually need it. If that gets called, right, or if something gets set on that, then something has gone wrong. Lastly, we're going to define a function. And in this function is where we're actually going to do our expect statements. Right? Actually, I'm going to change this around slightly. And you'll see why here in a moment. I'm going to move this also outside. Right. So that I can do a let rec equal. And the reason I want to do this, if we go back and look at that code again, one of the things we want to test for is that we get that rec.auth object that has our username password in it. Right, so if I look in lib/basic HTTP, what we do at the end of that is we set rec.auth equal to the auth object, which is going to have our username and password in there. So we want to have a reference to that rec as opposed to just creating an in-place object literal, so that we can check to make sure that rec.auth got set inside of it. Right? So in this final function, I'm going to expect arguments dot length to be 0. Right? What's arguments? What's that? Yeah, whatever actually gets passed into next when it gets called. Right? So arguments is a value that exists inside of every function inside of JavaScript. Right? It actually gives you an array-like object of the arguments that were passed into the function. Right? Everyone kind of remember this from functional programming day? Did we take a look at this? The arguments keyword? What was that?
It sounds very familiar. I just know that, but it's not the same as the arg. Yeah, we use
Dot args.
The spread operator.
That's just
Oh, yeah. That's basically a shortcut for this. Yep. So arguments, right, is an array-like object that contains all the arguments that were passed into the function that you're currently inside of. So what we're expecting is this next function to have been called with 0 arguments, right?
So whenever the next function is called, it is an array. Right?
Yep.
That's what we're expecting.
Yeah, I think now it is an array in the latest versions of V8. At one point, it was an array-like object. So actually, no, I'm pretty sure it still is an array-like object. Let's double check, because there's. Anyone have a good descriptor of the difference between, or can anyone explain in their own words the difference between an array and an array-like object? What the biggest difference is?
You can't use all the array methods on an array-like object.
Yeah. Basically, they work kind of the same way, but you don't have methods on it, right? So you have to either do a call, bind, or reply to be able to call array methods on an array-like object. And that's kind of the major difference. Other than that, like both an arrays and an array-like object are numerically indexed objects, right? Yeah.
I was going to say, aren't arrays the only ones that are indexed?
Index should exist on array-like objects. I'm pretty sure. If it doesn't, then we'll get an error and we'll have to figure something out. Usually .length, right, is actually not. It's not like a method, right? It's a property that gets set when you add or remove anything from an array. Which is why if you make an array of like a bunch of empty objects, that length contains all those empty objects. Anyway. Right? If we do something like, how many people have done something like this? All right, we create an R and then we set R at like 50. Right, it actually fills that up to the highest number. So if we take a look at R, it just gives us a bunch of commas, and then something after 50 commas. I used to make a comma chameleon joke there, but I forgot to do it today. So pretend I made a hilarious comma chameleon joke. Right, like if we did like R, I'm gonna make it anyway. R at like 5 equals chameleon, which I think I just spelt wrong. So I get comma, 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 chameleon. Yes! Nailed it. Home run. Yep. All right, so we're gonna expect rec.auth.username to be what? What are we expecting the username to contain?
Value.
Yeah, which value though? Test, right? And then we will expect, spelt correctly. And what is this going to be?
Super secret password.
My super secret password, guest1234. Right? Does this process make sense that we go through here? We pass in we make our own arguments, our own version of the arguments that the basic HTTP parsing middleware requires. Right? At the end of it, we have a function where we are expecting arguments.length to be 0, auth.username to be test, and auth.password to be guest1234. Yeah?
Can you go back over, I know you already hammered on it, where that null is?
Oh, yeah.
Why were you?
So the null is in there because we have to have an arity of 3 to be able to get this next function at the third part. Right, and inside of lib basic HTTP, right, that second object is res, but we're not actually using res anywhere in here.
Right, so that null became res.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is this what's going to be expected of us in our projects to test out basically every middleware?
Yeah, you should basically have integration tests for all your routes, right? And then for any helper functions or pieces of middleware that you write yourself, you should have a unit test for that, like at least one unit test. And that usually puts you at a pretty good spot. Other questions? Okay, cool. Let's run it and see how our tests go. Oh, I'm gonna have to start in Mongo for this. Everything I believe is installed. That's a very good question.
High speed low rate.
Fool me once.
No, shame on them. Only one shame on them. Twice, it's on them. I should have seen it coming.
All right, so we have an error. Whoops. Where did I just go? There it is. Expected 0.
Oh, that's the array like that.
Yeah. 7, huh? That's interesting. Oh, you know what it is? I wonder if it's grabbing it from the it. I think I know how to fix this. So since we're doing some context changing, normal functions don't need arrows. I think this should fix it. Right, I think it was changing the context to be this it test, right? Which is why we were getting 7, because of the way this it function that we've created is called by Jest, right? Jest has a bunch of extra parameters that it actually calls these functions with.
Made that 7.
Yeah, so it's passing in a bunch of stuff into this function that we've created. Actually, it's not even that function because this function changes that as well. I didn't know that. Do arrow functions change? Or anyway, that's something I got to look into. Let's try this. See if that gives us. Yeah. So it's. I didn't know that actually about arrow functions. It turns out when it changes the context, right? Because arrow functions have an implied context change. It actually changes the arguments too. That's not something I knew. That's fun. All right. So now we're getting. There we go. 2 pass, 3 pass.
So the implied context.
The context change is not just changing like what this is equal to,
Right.
but also changing what arguments is equal to for the arrow function, which is something I did not know about arrow functions. Yeah, that's strange. Did not know that. Any other questions right now? Ask them at me. We're not gonna dive too much into that arguments context change. It's not something that you'll have to know for 401 projects. Just if you're running into a thing where you're getting really weird results for arguments, change it to a normal function. Yeah, it has to do with context changes, and we're not going to spend too much time talking about that right now, but we might be able to later. I want to investigate that a little bit more before I try to speak to what's happening and why it's happening. No other questions right now? Okay. Cool. All right. It should fail with bad HTTP basic. All right, so now we'll write a failing test. And we're not going to dive too deep into writing failing tests, right? You could get into a lot of kind of use cases, right? If like header's not there or if the authorization isn't there, like any of those kind of pieces. And we could write individual tests for every one of the ways that this might fail. Right now we're just going to write one failing test to make sure that when this fails, we call next with an error in it, right? Okay. So let's just do this. Basic HTTP. We'll just pass it in an empty object, a null, and then a function. And I want to make this a non-arrow function. Non-arrow functions don't need arrows. Remember that. So we are going to expect arguments dot length to to be 1, right? And we are going to expect, we'll just make this an error. Error. Right, we're just going to expect it to be an error. Cowabunga?
I'm sorry, I missed the part. Why is it like the length to be 0 and then 1?
So we're expecting when it's successful, right? So basically, this is our equivalent of the next function that Express would be normally passing into our piece of middleware, right? So when it's successful, when we successfully call this, if I go back to lib basic HTTP, right? We call next without any parameters, right? So we're expecting 0 arguments being passed into next. When we have a failure, right? When we're catching this error, we're calling next with 1 parameter, so just 1 in arguments.
Can you go back to your example?
Yeah.
It seems like this test would always have to be true because you're actually passing a parameter in there.
That's a good point. There we go.
Like the fact that you're passing an error here would
Yeah.
not always be acceptable.
So let's do this then.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So basically, yeah, for the video, basically because I had a parameter in there, arguments it doesn't necessarily, isn't always going to be 1, but it makes it less clear as to what's going on, right? Essentially the question was, if I have the error in here, won't this always be 1? But you can actually still call that function with no arguments in it, right? And then just that first parameter becomes undefined, right? But this is a little bit more clear as to what's going on, I think.
Yeah.
It very clearly should be 1 if there's a failure, right, in this case. And then we're taking a look at the 0th argument and expecting that to be type of error, because we have that catch. Yep. All right, let's see what happens. Error and received object. Oh, right, because we're wrapping it in an object. All right, I think what we're actually doing in here, let's take a look. Is there another spot where we're calling next? Nope. Okay, let's do it this way. Test. We're just going to expect it to be an instance of error. I actually thought error was a primitive type in JavaScript. I don't think it actually is. So let's try this again. Yeah, there we go. And now we get 4 passed.
Is it uppercase error?
Yeah. And yeah, that's the the error constructor function.
Yeah.
Cowabunga on this testing process, does my logic seem sound? Or can you follow the way that I'm testing this, or why I'm making these decisions? Is there any piece that's confusing?
I understand that you want the length to be 0 because the next,
Yeah,
because
there.
the res is not being sent through that length has to be 0.
Can you repeat that?
Hmm?
Can you repeat that?
We want the length to be 0
Yep.
because we're sending res, but that null takes the place of res.
Yep.
And
And this is actually the next function though that we're defining, not something to do with res.
Oh.
Right, that's why we have the
That's
null,
right.
but the argument's length to be 0, right? That's because we're defining here what the next function would be, right? So we want to make sure that if it was successful, the argument's length should be 0 because we should have called next without any arguments in it to move on to the next piece of middleware and express.
We call it with error, that's why it's 1.
Exactly.
In general in middleware, is it bad practice to always just return next? So next, right, doesn't stop execution, but generally if you're calling next, it seems like you do want to stop execution at that moment no matter what.
Most of the time, yeah.
So would it make sense to always return
Um,
call the next?
It kind of depends on what you're doing, right? Like in this case, we're not returning a next because we have it wrapped in a try-catch.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, but there's no harm even in there.
no, we could even put a return next here.
Yeah, it's just that it's not necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right, and our code should still pass, which it does. Yeah, there's no harm in it. Yeah, you can just always return next, and that's usually fine. Unless maybe what you're doing is you're trying to spawn off some asynchronous work and then continue on, right? That doesn't necessarily have to do with the next
Yeah.
piece of middleware. That's definitely something you could do.
I have another just sort of just general question about, I think I generally kind of have a sense of it, but how you define what's considered middleware versus just the finalware.
Yeah.
Like how much logic my assumption would be that we're trying to minimize the amount of logic that's in the finalware.
Mm-hmm.
So
So it's either there's gonna be two things that are going to sort of indicate that you might want to split it off into a chunk of middleware. One is if you're doing a lot of processing, right? And the like your finalware gets to be like over 10 or 20 lines, right? 10's usually kind of my breaking point. If I see some of that's over 10 lines of code, that might be a spot that I want to transfer that into the middleware. And the other reason you would want to put something into a middleware is if you're using the same logic for more than one
Yeah.
end-where function.
okay.
Yeah. So those are kind of the two indicators that you might want to move that to a middleware or helper function, whatever makes more sense. Yeah, in general, I try to keep those routes to about 10 lines of code at the most. There's, exceptions to that, just like every rule in programming. But
I guess also if you make like a helper function for a route, so like you have multiple things that end up sending some sort of data, processing data, so it makes sense to maybe make a helper function that just sends data once you've done that. Is it fine to put that in the routes folder, or do you generally put that kind of stuff in your lib folder?
usually goes in lib.
Okay.
You can put it in routes if it's very specific to routing,
Yeah.
right? But lib is probably a better spot for that.
Okay.
99.9% of the time.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Reasons you might want to put it in routing, if it's like a function that, say you give this is actually a function that I've wrote a lot of times for various projects I've worked on that should probably just move into a library, but I haven't now that I'm saying it out loud. But like that will basically define a generic set of like routes for a resource by name. Right, so I could make notes, and it'll make a get, post, put, patch, and delete for notes.
Right.
Yeah, that's a function I've written a lot of times, and that might make sense to put in routes. I'll usually put it in lib anyway. It kind of just depends on how your brain works. Other questions? Ask them at me. Nothing right now? All right, let's go on a break, and then we'll do some deployment.